In our session today, we want to go over we want to make this an interactive webinar where we explore those ever-evolving landscape of global regulatory trends and their impact on information across all industries. As regulations, as we all know, governing product development, agency interactions, filings for product approvals, have become increasingly complex and geographically diverse. Regulatory professionals and medical writers both must adapt to ensure the compliance, the clarity, the effectiveness of their documentation to meet the intended needs. So we hope that this session will equip you with the background and practical insights needed to effectively understand and adapt your approach to the preparation of your regulatory documents. I see technical difficulties. I'm pressing the down arrow. I can't advance the slide.
Press the right arrow, Lori.
Right arrow. Okay, no, the arrows aren't working. Up or down. Yay. What should I do?
Laura, you can try hitting the escape button, which will take you out of presentation mode.
All right. Not happening. How about I come off my big screen and I use just my laptop? Oh, is a big delay. Look at that. Okay, let's get off of, what happens when I do this? I don't know what to do, guys. Sorry, I'm so sorry, everyone. There, okay, there. The button is working. Our session today. Ignore the last minute and a half. Here we are. In this webinar, we'll discuss a few of the key trending topics and issues related to changes in the global regulatory landscape, such as regulations then and now, while we'll examine historical and ongoing changes in global regulations and how these regulatory evolutions have reshaped the structure and content of key regulatory reports. And what's the impact of those changes? Understand how these regulatory evolutions have reshaped the structure and content of key regulatory reports and documents. And as always, at Criterion Edge, we like to talk about practical strategies that just help us get the work done. And today we want to focus on some writing efficiencies. So let's talk about learning strategies to tailor your internal writing processes to meet expectations and requirements of different geographic audiences, right? And Jeff is an expert on that, to ensure your documents remain relevant and compliant. So Jeff, I think this is where you take over. So since I can't quite see my notes, you might need to prompt me when I need to change a slide or when anything else I need to know.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lori.
Jeff.
Hello, everybody. Jeff Fadzinger, it's a privilege to be speaking with you all today. I'm not going to talk about the regulations themselves. I'm sure you all are not really here to have a regulatory lecture on the nuances of the technical changes. But one of the key things that impacts all of us in both regulatory affairs, writing, the scientists, is what does that mean for what we are producing? Have these changes impacted what we're saying, how we're saying it? And the answer is yes. So as we went from MDD to MDR and the new IVDR comes into force, there were a lot of technical changes in those areas, as you all know, just as there were in the pharma world for many of the same regulations in the CMC and others. But some of the key changes were what you say, how you say it, how much has to be written. What is the approach to the writing? The same for the IMDRF and then ISO. ISO was always very good about make sure your document, talk about. But these rapid changes, even though they weren't technically rapid in the scheme of things for us in the industry, we had a lot of lead time. But the challenges during that lead time was how to interpret. There was a lot of, the understanding of, well, what does this really mean? How is this really going to be read? How is a CER going to be looked at? What is the essential requirements if it's not essential requirements anymore? How do we relay the information on our in this case, if we're looking at devices and a device master file? What does this mean? How do you tell this story? And that's what this really is. In all of these, the output of this is a document in which you don't really have a lot of opportunity to discuss. The information has to stand on its own, unless you're getting RFIs or requests for additional information. It has to tell a story. And telling this story is changed around the world, whether you're in the US, whether you're in this, the CETIS countries, which is the core EMA, or you're in other European countries that still have a national approach, or if you're in Asia, Japan, if you're dealing with Korea, you're dealing with China, Australia, New Zealand, and then you go over to Latin America, we're having the resurgence of the diverse requirements and the understanding of information. Linguistics is a language. What you say in English may not always translate into Portuguese. It may not always translate into Japanese or into Chinese efficiently and effectively. So how we communicate is one of those key areas that as a regulatory professional and as a developer, that it is important that people understand that that has changed. And these new regulations have put a burden on semantics, content, clarity, conciseness, all of the things that we, sadly, I think we all took for granted in the past has changed, making the role of writers, that central pivotal role of taking things from people like myself, others in the clinical group, your toxicologists, your pre-clins, your engineers, they've got to synthesize all of our different perspectives and views and how we write and how we talk, how we communicate, and put it into a document that has national and geographical differences rather than this one consistency across all that we were, relatively used to having. Lori, I don't know if you wanted to comment on
No,
that impact to
I
you.
thank you. Yeah, I would only say that I echo your emphasis certainly on the impact of translating concepts, facts into a story that's written, that's accurate, and that, as I always say, start at the beginning and go to the end and stop. In other words, it has a flow. So ready for the next slide?
Absolutely.
All right. I think I skipped one. No, I didn't. Here we
Nope.
go. All right. So this is building on Jeff's comments. I don't know, some of you may know this movie from a couple of years ago, and it made me think of these images, is that the industry and, as a whole, people as individuals are trying to manage a whole lot of chaos or new confusion, and juggling many competing and sometimes never before encountered issues. So I just give this to you here about that it does feel like it's everything, everywhere, and all at once. And so this is a fun slide. Sorry if you don't understand the reference. And yes, that is a googly eye on Michelle Yao's forehead, and that is a raccoon hat over in the top left. But again, this is just a little bit about where our industry is and how we're trying to sort all of this out. So this is, I think that's a poll question. I think, Justin, is it time to put up the poll question?
Indeed it is. But everyone should be seeing a poll question appear on their screen right now. Feel free to submit your response as you'd like. We'll give it about 30 seconds before we close it and share the results.
Oh.
Have about half the respondents in so far. We'll give it another 10, 15 seconds for the few remainders. 5, 4, 3, 2. Last few. All righty.
So
Should be
thanks
good to see.
everyone for your responses. And Jeff, you can certainly weigh in here too. First of all, I want to give a shout out to the 2 people who did answer, what does a raccoon have to do with anything? But certainly 50% of the respondents just gave the simple yes. It's encouraging to see that, you know, a fifth of the folks thought things are busy, but we've got it handled, yay. And then the thing that I think we can all relate to, it just depends on what day you ask me. Jeff, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. And I have to say, I probably have picked what does a raccoon have to do with it, because
Yeah,
I'm
Jeff
going to be the
doesn't know
first to
this
say
movie.
I've never seen the movie. But what I think what it really does illustrate, and having been in almost all of y'all's shoes, is, you know, those that say, hey, depends on what day you ask me. If I add that and then those with the yes, it's that workload. And when you start looking at what has to come in this case, we're kind of targeting the medical device area, even though it's applicable to biologics, biosimilars, small molecule, is that it goes in waves. So, on what day you ask, some days, everything's under control. Other days you're having to do an entire module, because you've had an RFI and there's an amendment to it or a supplement, and you're having to turn that in. And what does that supplement look like geographically? Because you have the same information, in with PMDA, KFDA, you got the same stuff now in with the FDA as part of the PMA. How are you changing that? And then when it's not really, things are busy, but you got it handled, hats off to you guys. That's some organizational skills I don't possess. But it resonates with the dynamics of it is in flux and it's all the time. So those of you that responded, yes, this is how it feels. It has felt that way for 30 years for me. And I'm hoping to kind of outline and look at some of the strategies we can do to make this all things everywhere all at once. Help you all drive your teams to make things a little bit easier for you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Okay, I'll skip to the next slide, I think. I think I've got a bad button. I'm pressing the button. Here we go again. I can't advance the slides. What do we do?
That's a great question.
Lloyd, can you click on
Yes.
the mouse? Does that work?
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. I think we'll get rid of the button and stick with the mouse. Thanks, Mark. It's great to have our technical folks on the call just in case. All right, everyone, apologies. I think we've sorted out the final issues. So I wanted to linger on this with this quote before we move on. So this complexity, which we're all feeling, perhaps there's space in that complex milieu that we're all in, that we can find opportunities. Our companies can find opportunities to lead in the industry. Your team can find opportunities to lead within your company, adapt to these new regulations, and then eventually innovate. And innovate is just change, improve, get better. How can you, and maybe that's part of our conversation today, is that are there opportunities to improve through innovation? Next slide.
Okay.
What do you think here, Jeff?
Let's we're going to use MDD and MDR as an example here. Otherwise, I could do hours on, the impact of some of the changes and how they impact how we communicate and what we're presenting. But for example, in the older MDD, the terminology was essential requirements. Okay, we'd all been used to that for years, decades, and that's what we called essential requirements. We all created checklists. We'd all go online and pull one out. We would adapt them for whatever product that we were doing, whether it was a standalone or a combination. The MDR comes along, and it's a general safety and performance requirements. Well, that may be a semantic change, but that actually changes the work your engineers have to do. And it changes how in regulatory you have to perceive that information. And it changes how you're going to write that information. So that simple terminology changes is kind of the catalyst for changing communication. How are you relaying this information across diverse geographies where English is not always the predominant language? It's not the standard language in that area, but everybody has to read it. How do you communicate to this? Then you start looking at what are the document requirements. So now we've understood there's a terminology change that is going to change the information as presented. We're now calling it something else. Everybody's got to get used to that. Now we got to explain that internally. Now we're having to say, guys, it's not just an essential requirement. These are the general safety and performance requirements. But what does that mean? I'm now asking engineers to do a difference in the master file. Pull this together. What is the design file? But now we got to look at what are the documentations. Basic technical file. We were all familiar with that. We were all familiar with what went into it, what to ask. We always had to send examples back to the other team members in regulatory, and the writers that were involved were consistently frustrated by why do you keep changing this? Why do you keep changing this? But it was a format. Well, all of a sudden you had this expanded technical documentation with detailed clinical evidence. We used to could reference. We used to could gloss over things with semantics. Nope, not anymore. Now we have to interpret and write. So now the writer has to take comments from people like myself and the clinical team and the engineers and the sites and pull all of this together into this detailed clinical evidence of why do we know it works? Well, as before, a lot of times diagrams worked. Not anymore. Now you got to write it. But I've been doing it the old way for 25 years. So I'm the engineer going, but this is what I always gave you. You as a writer or as one of the team members leading it are like, well, yeah, but that's not, I can't do that anymore. I now need this and this. To be honest, a lot of us in our disciplines don't make good writers. We say what's in our head and we expect others to interpret it and put it down so that it makes sense, to the lay person or the person reading it, because everybody reading it is not, is not in clinical evidence. They're not regulatory. They're not all engineers. Somebody has got to take this and interpret it. And that changed from NDD to MDR, as did the clinical evaluation. You used to could reference it. It was easy. You didn't have to do a lot of writing. You didn't have to do a lot of text. You didn't have to do a lot of narrative. You do now. Now it is a detailed CER to give it a nice new, acronym, and we're calling it this. So now, much like in pharma, where you're doing your clinical study reports, you have an equivalent in this space, and that requires the input of a lot of people. That's a lot of people with different views, different linguistic skills, a lot of them the different perceptions. I have a very bad trait of assuming when I speak that people have my same perspective. So sometimes in my head, I will say 5 sentences, but verbally I'll say 3 words and expect people to know, well, that's what I meant. Do you not understand? Well, for the person who's having to interpret and write that down, the answer is no, I don't. I don't understand your 3 words meant this entire sentence. This became a challenge for teams. And it also became a challenge on the other side in the agencies for reviewing it, because a lot of people were not used to this unless they came from pharma directly, where you had to do such detailed reports that sometimes went overboard. In other spaces, even the reviewers were unsure. Why am I reading now a 50-page document as compared to a 20-page previously? It changed. It changed the review. It changed how the information is done, and it changed the assessment. The same thing under risk management. We used to have the typical, we all did the RA, we all sat down, what is the rating scale? We could all speak to engineers. They would say, well, we think it's this. Regulatory would go, well, I disagree because this doesn't look like it's mitigated. And then you would have your writing and documents group going, yeah, but we can't demonstrate it, but we can point to this. Everybody checks the box and signs off. Not anymore. It got very comprehensive. It mirrored what was going on in the pharmaceutical world. And then you had to look at your post-market surveillance requirements. That was kind of an afterthought. Now you've got to write it up. Now somebody has to delineate in a common understanding of what's going to be done after this, in this case, a device or combination product is on the market. Well, that's communication. Communicating that to somebody in, say, Romania is different than how that is communicated to PMDA. How's that communicated to Brazil? These subtle changes, the labeling, even the notified body involvement. I know that everybody in this call has had to deal with them. They used to just pop in and out, become an irritation. You responded to something, you went on, got a cup of coffee, moaned, and did it. Not anymore. Now this increased scrutiny is causing an increase in communication, an increase in understanding, and many of these people are new. They are new to the industry because there was such a shortage for a while. A lot of these people are on the job learning in some cases, and they have a different perspective or their own perspective on interpretation. And you're having to write this based on feedback from all of us on the team and make somebody understand that. It is, on surface, it doesn't look kind of like a big deal. It is a big deal. It has been responsible for an increase in delays, rejections, massive clock stops, and confusion. And that delay over the last, 5 years, on average for complex devices, has been sometimes up to 6 to 8 months. Not because the information wasn't correct. It was because nobody understood the information as written in the different groups that were reading it, and it was a disparate understanding of the semantics. Guys, we hadn't experienced that in 20 years. This was a big deal. Puts a lot of pressure on the writers, on the document groups, on quality, puts a lot of pressure to do that adjustment. And not everybody understands that. I'm one of the worst. I'll go just write it out. Doesn't work that way.
Thanks,
It's a
Jeff.
different animal.
I think we better move on. That was a great summarization. Thanks so much. Let's see if it's working. There we go. This is a little bit about what you've been talking about.
It
Right,
is.
and this is, yeah, I think that I just want to point out, I know that Jeff's going to point it out too. The notice over here where it says a medium risk and high risk category devices, that sometimes the answers will change. So if you can maybe briefly go over this one, and a point in fact, this is a slide that is already fixed. Some of you may have already noticed the typo that's on here. It looks like it has red lights around it for me, but I couldn't fix it. Sorry, everyone. So Jeff, just run us briefly through some of these challenges.
It's consistency is probably what the key out of this is. And if you look at how, when this survey was done, they were looking at devices, both medium and high risk, and look how close together they are. There's not a large difference in the interpretation and understanding of how this is, especially in the CER modality, but it's everything went up. All of the information requirements, all of the data, all of the complexity, it went up. And that's a big pressure for writers, for the document controls, for those organizing this. It didn't change us SMEs, because we'll just keep saying the same thing, but just in more detail. But it changes the team putting it together that has to write it and then has to review it. And, filling in the gaps, data insufficiency, you can't reference anymore. You have to fill it in. So now writers have to be interpreters. And, that can be a challenge, and it can be very tough. So, not being a core writer myself, I'm one of the ones that puts pressure on writers, and I'm one of the ones that asks for, take what I just said, make that sound better, make it simpler for a reviewer, fix that. I'm on the other side, but I am watching and seeing the challenges that you'll have to go through to deliver that, which is typically done very well. And we're thinking, well, you did that so easily, so now do it for this and do it for this. Lori, I don't know if on y'all side, when you all are having these writers sit in these teams, are you all seeing the same pressure? Are you all seeing the same responses from the
way
clients?
we work with our clients, our Criterion Edge team, there's a small team of writers that are assembled because, to your point, it takes more than one writer. One writer cannot assemble in any way, shape, or form the size of these documents. So we have a small team that work on some parts of the document. Our documents are almost always come with a template. So templates are a great, I would say, if I'm giving you all a pro tip out there, develop a solid template and what I like to call a pressure tested template, which is, that means that the notified body or any other type of, excuse me, regulatory authority has already looked at that report, excuse me, and seen and it's held up on the template itself. That story, start at the beginning, go to the end, and stop. That story, that template has held up. Hold on to that template, tweak it, use it again and again. Would be one thing I'd say. So we do see, that pressure that Jeff's talking about, because we all live and die by timelines. We all do. And I would say there's two types of time. There's the number of hours it takes you to do something and the number of days on the calendar that it takes to get something done. It's two different types of time. And so keep that in mind too in your planning. As far as my comments on this slide, before we go to the next one, it obviously jumps out, and this is a theme that we hear all the time, that the amount of sufficient clinical evidence and the data that supports the quote sufficient clinical evidence, that's a big deal. We get into conversations like that all the time with our clients. What does it mean to have sufficient clinical evidence? What does that mean at the end of the day? What is sufficient? And we've put on webinars just about that topic, about what your safety and performance objectives are. For example, in a CER, do you have data that supports your claims, your safety and performance objectives? Do you have data that supports your device's position within the therapeutic landscape as relating to its competitors? So those are all sufficient clinical, those are all ways in which clinical evidence is used. And PMCF data, of course, is one. And now real world evidence is coming up as a source of data to be used. It still is early days for real world evidence that then can be analyzed to become real world data. And I think it's still early in that conversation about how ultimately real world data can be used to demonstrate safety and performance of a device or efficacy of an IVD device or a pharma biologic. So I'll move on to the next slide, see what else we're going to talk about here. Oh, this is that's the poll question. If you could put it up, Justin.
Poll number
There we are.
two should now be live.
What do you consider your biggest challenge? I thought did we already have that one?
Nope.
Poll question number 2, biggest challenge.
The last one was the everywhere all at once.
Everywhere all at once one. Yep. And there's that, not enough time, hours in the day or days on a calendar. Oh, the switching. I hear what you guys are saying about that. We'll see. Let's see what the results tell us.
Alrighty, we'll give everybody about 15, 20 more seconds before we shut it down. Feel free to get in those last few responses. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Maybe last few. Alrighty.
Well, the majority clearly is the switching, bouncing from, I think we can all, that's because we're all super busy. And that switching is a problem for our writing team as well, the switching back and forth, because writers tend to go into a zone and like to be in a zone, or anyone, and anyone, it's not just for the realm of writers. Anyone is, if you're concentrating, you do your better work when you're left alone and you can concentrate and get to the end. right? It's that whole thing about getting to the end. I'm done. But the switching back and forth creates space for chaos and stress, and worst of all, mistakes. So thanks for your responses. No critical issues. Bravo. Love that. Not enough time. Clocked in at a second. Not enough time. And the deep bench of expertise. Thanks everyone for your great comments and responses. Can you take that down there, Justin?
Yep, should be down now.
Yeah, I think that was it makes sense. You know, I do cause a lot of writer and team members to switch. It's one of those things when you're, especially if you're doing an RFI. And I think one of the things that needs to be recognized is when, as these writers are taking this information, this constant switching from one document to another, one dossier to another, you know, one, is it an IFU? Is it, you know, is it a patient information? Those constant changes, you know, and on the regulatory side, they're just requirements. We just relay them. We tell you, we need it, it's got to look like this, it's got to look like this. And by the way, need it tomorrow. And hey, by the way, you need to do it on this, you need to do it on this. And the additional changes in a lot of the legislation and the global views on that legislative change puts even more pressures on how that's relayed, on the finish, the text that's used, the language that is used. The language I may be telling you may not be the right language, and you're having to figure that out. And I'm going, well, why didn't you do what I say? Well, you said the regulation said this. We have to term it as this. It has to be readable here. It's a tough job that y'all have. And it's, you know, and the regulations don't make it easier, unfortunately.
Thanks, Jeff. So on this slide, we're seeing here some implications, potential influence of, in this case, EU MDR. This again is taken from this Kearney-McDermott reference on the clinical evaluation regulatory strategies. And I think the top one comes as no surprise to any of us in the medical device industry, this is for high-risk categories. And I can only guess that when there's missing information, like there's nothing about low risk, medium risk here, and there's no responses here at all. This came straight out of the published literature. So I believe that this means that no one responded with regards to this question, demonstrating equivalence. And in here, no one responded with regards to medium risk category. That's my explanation of why it seems like some information's missing. But with regards to this, it comes as no surprise that SKUs are being eliminated, essentially. Where companies can't go through the enormous expense and expenditure of resources to drive all of their medical devices to the market when they may have redundancies in their inventory and the types of devices that they have. So this top one, I think, speaks for itself. I think the second one, we plan to launch devices first in the US or another market and pursue CE marking at a later stage. I've been in the medical device industry long enough, and Jeff may attest to this as well, and many of you as well, is that I remember when it was the opposite, is that medical device companies first went to the EU before they tackled the FDA and the US. So that's, there we go. There's a little bit of a switch. And the last one is interesting. We've invested significantly in clinical evaluation training. Now, Jeff and I were actually discussing that one before the call. And I felt anyway, that doesn't necessarily mean who were you training exactly, your team, and to understand the regulations. I think that's probably a true statement. Of course, you have to, your regulatory team certainly, and then the other folks in operations and every other department that is touched by these wide-ranging conversion of MDD to MDR or IVDD to IVDR. What I saw, because we're a writing team, I saw the same thing, but I saw it through the lens of, and our writers had to be all trained as well, as to how to tackle this. And that's some of the comments that Jeff has been talking as well. So Jeff, you have anything briefly to add? I want to give us plenty of time to get to our questions, and I'm not sure, think we might be running
Yeah,
out.
no, I think you summarized that. I do believe that the changes made it more difficult for in-house potentially to adapt and address the needs. And that, always adds additional pressure. And, so, but I think you summarized it, but, me on the CER, I think that, putting those together kind of changed, and having to train and re-educate those that were used to doing it a previous way for 15, 20 years kind of is a burden, and it's stressful.
It is.
So I can understand that those
Yeah.
responses.
Let me see here. All right, so here's some of those challenges that so many of you answered. Yes, we've got a lot of challenges. So this is another slide, again, taken from that same reference. Percentage of respondents who outsource the generation of the CER, and then the rationale for the outsourcing. We've talked a lot about, it's one thing to conceptualize your regulatory strategy and your regulatory pathway. All that needs to be crystal clear to everybody so that your internal team, can execute on that. Well, that also has to be communicated and crystal clear to the folks that are writing the CER as well. And so the outsourcing means that there's an extra burden, honestly, on your internal team to assimilate the external writing team with your internal team. That's the most efficient way to get a writing team up to speed. Include them from the beginning, or at the beginning of that the process happens. So that we are here at Criterion Edge, we're often embedded in internal team meetings, not a lot of them and not all of them, but critical ones where we can hear and understand what's going on and apply that in the written documents. So that percentage of respondents that outsource CERs, and it says, no, we generate our CER in-house, 76%. All right. That is, I think the winds of that are changing a little bit in 2023, but we'll see. But yes, of course, many companies have enough resources in-house to generate their CER. But others perhaps don't. Yes, for all devices, 6%, and certain high-risk devices, another 6%. And then I think the 12% one is the section that's going to grow over time, but only since transitioning to EU MDR. And I suspect that over time, internal teams are going to be so burdened that, and the regulations are going to continue to tighten. Notified body scrutiny is really going to start clamping down in the next few years, if it hasn't already, that some companies may decide to pull in external writers to bolster their internal team. And then with regards to the other one, rationale for outsourcing generation of the CER, I think it's no surprise that 62%, almost 2/3, lack of internal expertise. I think that goes a lot to what Jeff has been talking about, is that good regulatory affairs professionals and good scientists don't always make good writers. They can only see through their lens, and writers tend to see through the document lens. How am I going to get through this document? So anything, but nobody, I would point out, nobody thinks that outsourcing a generation of a CER is more cost effective. I've got a different view. I think that when you outsource anything, you're paying for exactly what you get. And if you get a good product, it might be worth the money, versus I think this 0% more cost effective might be a misunderstanding that, well, Sally in the corner, she can write it. She's already bought and paid for it because she's an employee. So it, quote, doesn't cost us anything. Well, it does. It costs Sally's time and all the things that Sally isn't doing, because now she's been assigned to write a monumental 500-page CER. So any thoughts there, Jeff, before we move on?
No, I think you summed it up right. I think this is a direct response to the volume of information changes. The regulatory elements that changed were more about the detail on what has to happen, but this was kind of a general trend towards having that support network is a direct reflection of the amount of pressure that us as SMEs put on writers and compilers because the information volume has changed. And bigger ones are able to keep up with it, or they have fewer products. They have bigger gaps. But when you're having to conform them or having to have them updated, because they're all still on the market, that switching occurs here. And I would agree that taking some of that pressure off by adding an external writer to the team to supplement and augment what is already there is going to be a continuing trend, and I think a necessary one, because that expert from afar syndrome removes some of the pressure and allows the internal writers to kind of drive it rather than having to kind of bully people
Yeah.
into getting what they want.
Okay. Okay, so we are at our final thoughts. So writing is hard, who knew? Focused and segmented, giving the right information to the right audience, or some key takeaways, clear and consistent messaging, make a plan and stick to it. So that is the end of our presentation. Justin, I'll roll it to you to, what do we do next as far as getting people's, I think there have been some questions that have been submitted, certainly on registration and then during the webinar. What would you like me to do? Click through this?
Yeah, so we can go ahead and transition into our Q&A portion of today's presentation. So if anyone has any questions that they have not had a chance to submit already, there is a Q&A button at the very bottom of your screen that you can use to submit those if you'd like. I'll also be including an email in the chat here shortly that you can use to submit any more confidential or proprietary questions if that's something you're more comfortable with. That said, we can go ahead and kick things off with our first question that was submitted.
So Justin, do you want me to click?
If
There it
you
is.
don't mind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There we go.
What document strategies allow for a single global dossier to meet regional requirements of specific countries? Best practices for a global document approach despite regional differences.
Yeah, so I think this, so let's, Jeff, let's try to get through these questions as quick as possible, because I know we can opine for probably 10 minutes on each. For the audience, this is two separate people submitting two similar questions, and that's why I put them on one slide. So what are some of the document strategies and best practices for putting together a global document? Some document strategies, I'll just start really quickly by saying that it's one word and it's the template. I can't emphasize that enough. The template, if you have a solid template for whatever you are writing, whatever report you are putting together, it's no accident that the ECTD or the ETD or any of those massive reports are highly templated. It's like leads you through it. So I think, to me, a document strategy is to take time to create a template that your team can agree on, that is aligned with whatever regulations apply to that particular document, and stick with it. It's your roadmap. Jeff, any quick comments about this?
I would also say pressure your regulatory group to ensure that you are informed of what the subtle differences are. There is no such thing anymore as kind of that global dossier. You kind of design global but act local. And you need to make sure that you have been informed of what those subtle differences are, and also what those subtle differences regionally might mean from semantics, because I can't stress enough that not everything translates, correctly by intent when you're going from English into another language or from another language into English. And having control of that, creating those templated, kind of almost questions of, if A, then B, is very important, but it's communication. And this whole thing is about written communication, but verbal communication is also essential. And it is essential that your SMEs continually verbally interact with anybody writing, but regulatory especially, you have a right to expect from them a clearly defined approach and what is required. And if they're not doing that, it'll take twice as long and be 3 times as stressful.
Great, thank you, Jeff. One thing I'll just finish by saying best practices for a global document approach. One thing that I think Jeff and I have talked about before is if it is a single document, but you need to create it for this competent authority or this geography. One trick that, folks that are in documents a lot, flag those areas, flag them, make them a different color, put a note next to them, something is like this change, this I wrote for Italy that doesn't apply for the UK or Britain. So if you flag things that have to change in a document that's going to be sent out to different regulatory authorities, that will help you follow the breadcrumbs back. Okay, let's go to the next question. Info about trends regarding recent onboarding of regulatory and clinical professionals, oh my, by EU notified bodies. Are they still adding folks? Is it continuing? Is it leveling off? Are there still gaps? Jeff, a few comments on this?
Yeah, there are still gaps. We all know that even if we say the word European Union, we know that doesn't mean much anymore. We're not all getting along. And that has added to this complexity. You take out Brexit, which has also thrown a considerable doubt into the existing unified system when it shouldn't have. It has caused a knock-on effect where many countries in Europe that were under the single system, the CTIS approach, are going nationalistic. And as a result, there are shortages. And those shortages and gaps still exist across the spectrum in notified bodies and the health agencies. It's improving, but they're bringing in less experienced and less mature reviewers. So when I go back to that learning on the job, many of them are, and that changes how you approach it. So the complexity of your language can become a challenge because you now have to kind of, I hate to say this, but kind of write to the lowest common denominator simply because that age and wisdom isn't there. And a lot of these people haven't been exposed to it. So if you're writing from a position of what I call power knowledge, many of the new ones will just have a deer in the headlight look. So it's getting better, but the gaps are still there. It causes a lot of RFIs for clarification of many documents in both the drug and device space.
And I can just add, before we move on to the next question, another note from our perspective is if we engage with a client and we drive documents, we write the documents that are driven for submission to a notified body, it'll be at least 6 months before they hear anything back. So we may not work with that client again, but they call us when the responses, to help with the responses when they come back. And again, I think that's a great strategy, is like whoever wrote it and worked with the team and was in the document can help with the responses. And we've seen, as a little bit of the outsider looking in, the regulatory teams and the clinical folks that we work with our client and on those teams, they can be frustrated sometimes, as I think many of you might relate to. Frustrated, I don't understand the question. Why are they asking that? Don't they understand? So then it gets into that back and forth a little bit. But as we all know, with responses, there's a clock ticking. And so we've got to work really quickly to try to correct whatever or respond to whatever the notified body is asking about and move on. Okay, so let's go on to the next question then. This is a little bit about what we talked about already. Thanks for someone saying this. Jeff, from our perspective, I've already kind of briefly jumped into this by saying is that certainly comment in your document, mark in your document where you left off, where things are still pending, what is locked information is a good way to get synergy. and then what is still in flux. But this specifically asked about gaining synergies in doc prep for multiple markets. And so, you know, to me, I think that's a lot of creating a different template, because obviously that may be necessary if you're going to a different market. The template of the document may not be the same. So there's a lot of room here for error, you know, as you're trying to do this in 5 different markets. Any thoughts on that, Jeff?
It is true. Planning, I can't stress enough, plan. Make sure regulatory supports you in understanding the subtle differences in the market you're going into, because sometimes it is simply an addition or a word difference. And as you're creating some of these templates or initial draft or outlines, it helps to have it in a single document. You can have North America, then have, for example, you know, Bulgaria or Japan, have a little call out in the same document where there is where regulatory has put a definition of, you know, what needs to be here. But it all comes down to the planning and conversational discussion.
And the flagging, yes. And you said a very important thing is that the writers may or may not have direct experience writing for, you know, TGA, for example, on something, or some competent authority in the EU. So the regulatory people really have to be the resource here to flag changes. And then if we have that, we the writers, if we're doing multiple documents for different regions or markets, we can lean on that experience from the regulatory affairs professional to tell us what the differences are. And then, you know, any good writer should be able to organize the document themselves, but it's the understanding what the changes are and how to rewrite that is pretty important. I think we've got time for one more question. Let's sneak it in. A couple of minutes there, Jeff, if we run over, people can still hang on. What's the answer here?
It's a tough
regional
one.
Differences in acceptance expectations of submission packages built from modules rather than docs, for example, the ETD.
Yeah, there are. When you start looking at ETDs, which is your digital version of a technical documentation, and that consolidates information. Modules refer to the structure of how that submission is done, and it's aligned with a specific guidance and requirement that doesn't necessarily translate into what the ETD is expressing, because the ETD serves as a comprehensive and structured document to present a detailed data, and it's in electronic form. So it makes it easy to manage and share, but not necessarily to be introduced into a regional module, you know, whether you're doing a module 4, or if you're doing a module 5, or whatever it might be. That is a structural approach. And unfortunately, there is not a consensual alignment in many key areas, especially between Asia and the West. But even insofar as dealing between Europe and North America, there are deltas in how an ETD is translated into a specific module and what that looks like. It's improving, but it's down to interpretation. The module has to be structured as required, but the ETD can then be used to fill in that module insofar as you're answering the question.
Thank you. I think that is another question, that there's that lean writing practices. I'm just wondering if I think we're done here. Thank you all for your time and attention today and your patience with our initial technical kerfuffles. Justin, do you have anything to wrap up?
Just as a friendly reminder, if you do have any last minute questions, you can use the email that's in the chat, consult@criterionedge.com. In addition, if you'd like to schedule a free consult with one of our experts to discuss a current or upcoming project, we would love to talk. You can use the link in the chat as well to schedule a day and time that works best for you. Lastly, we will be sending out a recording of this webinar in the coming days. Please keep an eye on your inbox and let me know if you have any other questions once you receive that. That said, hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their Wednesday, and we look forward to seeing you on our upcoming webinars that are found on our event page on our website. Thank you so much.